I am Brian Walter. I'm the Director of College Counseling at SCH. Welcome to all of you. I'm guessing that some of our sophomore parents are familiar with the faces on the screen, but some of you ninth grade parents, welcome. So joining me up here, we see Polly Kimberly and Kim Krieger. We're the three college counselors, and I'll save our guest for a few minutes down the line for his intro. But it's beautiful. It's probably one of the most beautiful nights in the last few months. So we appreciate you choosing to spend this 45 minutes, hour with us talking about college. So just to sort of walk you through the night, I'm going to sort of do some light myth, reality, it depends with some sort of fact and fiction in the college admissions world that you guys can be thinking about as you work with your child over whatever phase you're in, 9th or 10th grade parent. We're going to introduce our speaker, and then we're going to do a Q&A after that. And so if you want to type some questions, and we prefer that you use Q&A and not the chat feature. So without further ado, let me get to my screen here. Okay. So hopefully y'all can see that. And all right, so this speaks for itself, I think. And ultimately, any event we have, we want our families to walk away maybe sighing a breath of relief and understand they're in good hands here. Again, whether your son or daughter or child is in 9th or 10th, we are here for them as we move through the process. We do everything we can to educate our families. And again, we're here. We love working with our kids. Everything will be okay, really. Just to give you a sense of that, many of you have heard, certainly last year, college applications skyrocketed, especially due to the sort of COVID created test optional phase that's bounced in. This will be upcoming, the third year of that sort of test optional wave. And you saw numbers that were sort of hard to believe, 30%, 50%, 60% increases in applications across the board. Again, you may have heard that things were pretty tough this year, whether you heard it through word of mouth or heard it in the media. But just to give you a kind of a sense of where our students sit right now on April 12th, which the process isn't quite done, 87% of our kids of this current senior class have already been admitted to one of their 2 top choice schools. And that's a number that we use probably over the last 10 years to kind of give us a realistic sense of our kids getting into the schools that they want at our school. And that's right now, that number probably might creep into close to 90% with the wait list. So your kids are going to be okay. Our kids are going to be okay. So that's the main thing as we move forward. So again, I have 3 sort of myth, reality, or it depends for each grade parent. So we're going to start with this. Let's see. All right. So myth, reality, or it depends for 10th grade parents, but 9th grade parents, you can play along too. This is probably the thing we get asked about the most as college counselors, which is interesting because more and more schools are now, almost everywhere, students look at it as test optional, but testing is still in everybody's mind. So students should take the SAT, ACT, or SAT as soon as possible in junior year. So myth, reality, or it depends. I'll give you 5 seconds on your own. All right. That is a myth. All right. So most SCH juniors take their first ACT or SAT in the second half of junior year. So maybe December, but more often February, March, April, May. Taking the test too early, we found, can actually sort of hamper a student from reaching their ultimate goal. There's no one size fits all sort of philosophy when it comes to testing. Rushing the exam though, and taking multiple tests is not the way that our advice. There are some test prep people out there who may offer different advice, but certainly from our college office, rushing to take it as soon as possible, taking both tests multiple times is not the strategy we would support. Yes, it's nice to hear that most schools are test optional and probably will remain for the hopefully the next 5, 10, forever. But we also don't want to say, don't worry about the test. So it's kind of finding that balance. We want all of our juniors to take 1 test before the end of junior year. That is sort of our minimum requirement. And we like them to take it and actually prepare for it. So it's preparing for the test. Who knows if the student might need it or not for whatever group of schools that they wind up looking at, but that's just something to think about. A lot of parents feel like they need to cram in prep summer before junior year. Let's take an October test or a November test. And we've found out that's not really a great strategy. So again, there's no one size fits all for this. All right, so next one up. Unless I am the next LeBron James or Alex Morgan, I will never get recruited as an athlete due to COVID-created recruiting chaos. So this one, we had as it depends. So the extra COVID years, sort of the NCAA is granted, and the growing transfer portal has changed the recruiting landscape, and that's really at all three levels. But students who are willing to look at a range of options, we found really do have more options. So I mean, options at schools like D2 and D3. So things are pretty complicated right now with sort of backlog of, again, students who stayed for a fifth year, and that continues as we move forward. And if you talk to coaches in college right now, they're going to tell you between the transfer portal, extra classes they've recruited that aren't playing, it's really tricky to where kids who are, current sophomores, especially even as you move forward, you might start hearing that from coaches now or certainly next year. We've seen it with our current juniors. But the good news is we usually have about 25 to 30 student athletes in a class at SCH. And almost all those students, even in the last 2 years, which have been tricky, have found a home. Now, we usually send about 10 to 12 to Division I, and that's a tougher, a little more complicated of a process. The kids that have been willing to look at D2 and D3 have certainly had more predictability, and I would say more options. So just as you kind of move forward, there is a world out there. There are homes. It just might take a little longer, and that can be really frustrating. And sort of students are saying, I put on all this time, I've trained for the last 3 years, and I'm not hearing from coaches at the places I thought. It's just we continue in this unknown phase in a lot of parts of this process, but the athletic recruiting is complicated right now. We have seen students find homes. It just might take a little longer. And that's something you can work with certainly your club coach, the coaches here, and your college counselor. All right. So the final one for 10th grade parents. This one might be a little easier. Applying to only highly selective colleges, even with incredible academic credentials, is a tough way to go in the application process. So hoping that many of you said that is a reality. So when we see students who limit themselves to looking at those schools that are the sort of sub 20% admit rate world, they are bound to face some tough decisions and potential disappointment. Again, as you kind of move into this second year of these crazy increases in applications, what you're seeing this year is many schools are up maybe only 8%, 10%, 6%, but that's on top of what we saw last year, where again, it was the 30 to 50, 100%. I think totals none of us had ever predicted would see in a single year. Those sort of 50 schools or so, and there's about 50 that have a sub 20% admit rate. Those 50 schools, if a student really is limiting themselves to that world, that is going to be a tough way to apply to college. And so what we're asking you is to partner with us and help those students see the hundreds of other world-class schools that are out there in this country and around the world, where students can get that top level education. And again, they're just because the school has an admit rate that's 40%, 50% doesn't mean it doesn't offer a top-notch education. Sometimes I think kids struggle with that brand. That's certainly something that I'm proud of as a school, that we've really pushed for that, to find the right fit. And it's getting tougher and tougher to get into those. Again, there's about sort of 50 of those schools. The good news is most schools, the majority of schools, admit over 60, 70% of the students. So that's the good news. But I think sometimes those 50 or so schools, unfortunately, move the media market as well. And anyway, the more you can work with us and your child to look at that other world, the more helpful it'll be. All right. So this was for 9th grade parents. When my child applies to college, their grades from 9th grade really won't matter. Give you 2 seconds. Okay, that is a myth. So the majority of colleges and universities will take into account a student's grade from freshman year. However, there are some schools, some of the UCs, who will only consider grades from 10th grade on. Many schools may not put as much weight into 9th grade academic performance. They may just be prioritizing 10th and beyond. But the main message about 9th grade is what can we do moving forward? So schools really do want to see an upward trend. Most schools will forgive sort of a rougher start for a 9th grader. There are some that just aren't. And that's something that I think we have to have sometimes tough conversations with maybe juniors to say, look, if you have 3 or 4 Bs in 9th grade, there are a handful of schools where that's going to be really tough to overcome. Most are willing to look at the full picture. So those are just things we sometimes talk to. We met with 9th graders in their advisory. we gave them the same message this year, and we showed them a transcript and we talked about moving on. But I do think it's important to understand that for the most part, there is still a chance to kind of build that academic narrative. And there are a handful of schools who don't actually look at ninth grade, but for the most part, it does count. It is sent in a student's application. All right, so when it comes to non-academic and extracurricular factors, the admissions process, more and exotic is better. All right, so we're gonna move to, that is a myth. Okay, so colleges really do wanna see what a student cares about outside the classroom, how they spend their time, but depth and commitment and authenticity are more important than more and exotic. So a summer lifeguarding job is as valuable as, a 3-week program in South America. There's no formula or right combination of non-academic pieces that for a student to just follow, paint by numbers, and then get into the schools that they want. More than ever, though, I can say that colleges, I think, are interested in sort of how you're doing some good in your local community, in your school, how you're making the world a better place. And it sounds cliche, but I think that's goodness right now for students is probably more valued than ever. And I think we can all understand why that may be the case given the last 2 years we've all been through. So again, more is not better in this process than sort of the non-ac piece. And sometimes that seems counterintuitive. Finally, okay. At SCH, students can easily find spaces where they can get involved in the life of school and shine. Okay, this is an easy one. That is a reality. From players to facilitators, robotics, the arts, we're a school that allows students to find their people and really shine. But the message for ninth graders or a ninth grade parent is you can't wait till senior year to get involved. So our message to the ninth graders when we met with them was, you get a lay of the land. And then next year is your time to plant some seeds. You've gotten sort of, maybe they're involved in a couple of things now, but this is an easy place to really make your mark. And that's whether you have a leader, sort of all-rounder kid, you have a student who's still trying to figure it out, or you have one of those kids maybe a little more lopsided already. Maybe they just know they want to be a writer, and that's fine. Get involved with that. I mean, colleges are looking for all those different kinds of kids. All right, so those are just some things to get the conversation going. I'm going to pull off this. And I get to now introduce our celebrity speaker for the night, who's up there somewhere. I don't know where he is for you, but so Shawn Abbott is the Vice Provost for Admissions, Financial Aid, and Enrollment Management at Temple University, the public university of Philadelphia. Prior to his arrival at Temple, Shawn was the Assistant Vice President and Dean of Admissions at New York University, the largest independent university in America, with campuses in New York, Abu Dhabi, and Shanghai. Shawn was the Director of Admission at Stanford from 2006 to 2010, and previously served the admissions office at Columbia University for nearly a decade. He has also served as Assistant Director of Admissions at BU and as Assistant Director of Alumni Relations at Drexel. He has also worked at both the State University and Community College in the Boston area. In addition to his work at NYU, he serves as a consultant for the U.S. Department of State's Office of Overseas Schools, where he visits schools in the Middle East, educating families and counselors on the admissions and financial aid process at American colleges and universities. He's a first-generation college student and is a graduate of the University of New Hampshire and the University of South Carolina. He also holds a Doctor of Education degree in Higher Education Administration with a focus in urban studies from Columbia, where he studied the architectural, economic, physical, and social impact of urban colleges and universities on American cities. Very impressive. Shawn, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So what I thought I would do is maybe share 4 or 5 observations that I have about the college admission process. And anytime I typically do this, what I try to do is really think about when I was 17 or 18, or maybe if we're talking about 9th and 10th graders, maybe even younger than that, some observations that I really wish I had back at that point. Brian just mentioned I was a first-generation college student, so I really kind of went through this process somewhat blindly and really didn't have the kind of sophisticated college counseling that you have at your school. And so anytime I give a presentation like this, I try to think about like what I wish I knew, or what I think my parents wish they knew when I was in the 9th or 10th grade, and advice that maybe could have helped me be a little bit less anxious about the process. And I have maybe 4 or 5 observations that I hope are helpful. Does that sound okay. I mean, I have to admit, I don't have a plan B and I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, so it sort of has to be okay. But thanks for having me. I mean, I would say the first observation that I would have, actually, maybe even before I do that, I would echo every one of your slides back there. And I thankfully got all of them right. And I was a little panicked that I might have got a few of them wrong, but I did get all of them right. And I think that was really good advice to start the program off. You know, if I had a couple of observations I'd start with, or, you know, if I could only zero in on one, or if I could only give you one observation or one recommendation, it would be that of all the things that we could talk about tonight, I mean, we can talk about everything from interviews to letters of recommendations to portfolios and auditions to demonstrated interest to early decision. We could talk about probably 300 topics that are related to the college admission process. I don't know that I could share anything that is more important than relaying to you that unequivocally, there's no more important part of the college admission process than your academic record. And that's something that is consistent across all of the institutions that I've represented, from BU to Columbia to Stanford to NYU to here at Temple. There isn't one part of the admission process that is more important than your academic record. And I would say increasingly so now that we're sort of in this world of test optional admission, and where one's academic record really does carry the brunt of, or the kind of, it's unequivocally the most important part of this process. And I would say, regardless of the kind of institution that I've represented, or even maybe the role that I played in an admission office. I mean, I as a first year admission counselor at Columbia University, I was responsible for reviewing all of the candidates that we would receive from the city of Philadelphia and greater Philadelphia. From that point to being the director of admissions or the dean of admissions, I would say I cannot think of an instance in reading an application for admission where I didn't start with one's transcript. It's always the first document. As soon as I open up an application, as soon as I open up a file, it's the first document that I review in conjunction with the school profile. So the really two documents, but your academic record is unequivocally the most important part of this process. And I'm glad you kind of underscored, Brian, the importance of ninth grade, because, you know, I would say that during the period where standardized testing was largely required by most American college universities, I would say ninth grade probably had less importance than it does now. I would say now that we're in this kind of test optional admission world, ninth grade does carry probably more weight than maybe it did 5 or 6 years ago. That said, I can think of plenty of circumstances where a student perhaps had a rocky start to their first year in a high school, or they had maybe more modest grades in ninth grade, but in 10th grade, grades started to improve and the level of academic rigor started to improve. And then by 11th grade and 12th grade, you're really looking at a very different kind of candidate than ninth grade. And I can think of plenty of examples, even at super selected places like Stanford and places like Columbia, where a college university is going to be forgiving for maybe a rocky start to one's first year. So all to say that even if you haven't had the most ideal academic transcript in that ninth grade, there's still plenty of time to kind of reinvent yourself and turn on the power in 10th grade, 11th grade, and 12th grade. But you should know that virtually every college university that you'll be applying to will start with an analysis of your academic record, really paying attention to the courses that you've chosen to take, the level of rigor that you have attempted, and your overall academic performance. I don't know of too many college universities that get really fixated on grade point average and really kind of calculating a specific number that is assigned to you as a candidate, but your overall grades and your performance from 9th grade to 12th grade, super important. If I had any advice that I would love to influence for a 9th or 10th grader, it's not to drop foreign language senior year in high school. That's something that we see that can really kind of separate students from really competitive to less competitive. When students really kind of, I would say, drop that foreign language their senior year, that can be somewhat problematic at those super selective places. I would say most highly selective college universities would like to see chemistry, physics, and biology under your belt by the time you're graduating from your school. And if you're looking at those super selective places and you're aiming to study a STEM discipline, particularly engineering or maybe even business, I would say that most of those super selected places that you might be interested in will be expecting that you are calculus ready by the time you arrive on any particular college university campus. So if you are looking at one of those super selected places, really thinking about how you're going to be able to get to calculus by your senior year is likely something that's going to be important. Second observation that I would have that I want to share with you is that the world has changed through this pandemic with regard to standardized testing in a pretty accelerated fashion. Now, there are certain places like Temple and the University of Chicago and George Washington University and Trinity College that were test optional before the pandemic. But, Brian, you just mentioned that the sweeping majority, if virtually not all of the college universities that might materialize on your list of places that you may desire to apply to, will likely not be requiring standardized testing for the admission process. I mean, there are definitely going to be exceptions. You've all likely heard that MIT made the announcement in the last 30 days or so that they are going to require standardized testing. And from what I believe, the University of Florida and the Florida public college universities, I don't think they ever went test optional, even during the pandemic. So there are definitely going to be outliers. And then you're going to find that there are outliers at the opposite end of the spectrum, places like the University of California system. Brian, you mentioned that the UCs or the University of California colleges and universities do not typically pay much attention to ninth grade. And they are also one of those kind of collection of college universities that have decided to be test blind in the admission process, meaning even if you want to submit standardized testing, you are not, those tests are not going to be considered in the admission process. So I think you're going to have outliers on both ends of the spectrum, but you probably can safely assume that 3 to 4 years from now, when you're applying to the college universities of your choice, that you're not going to be required to submit standardized testing. And I wouldn't say that that's entirely altruistically motivated by colleges and universities. I would say that largely has to do with the reality that college universities really enjoy the large application volume that they have become accustomed to during this kind of test optional admission movement. And they have all realized that, much like places like Temple and Chicago and GW and lots of small liberal arts colleges decided and learned many, many years ago, that you don't really need standardized testing to make good admission decisions. So if you can bring in a first-year class of remarkable academic quality without requiring standardized testing in the admission process, you're likely going to kind of continue that process. So I'm going to be shocked if you if we fast forward 3 to 4 years from now and college universities really bring back standardized testing to the degree that standardized testing was required prior to the pandemic. I personally think it's a beautiful thing. You now have much more choice than any of us had when we were applying to college universities and when parents typically applied to college universities. I mean, I remember being a high school senior and not being really proud or excited about my standardized testing, but at that point in the late 1980s, if you wanted to apply as a test optional candidate, you were, from what I remember, largely restricted to going to college in Maine. I remember like 3 or 4 colleges in Maine that were test optional, and I didn't want to go to Maine for college. But now you have college universities all over the United States of a variety of different sizes and collections that you have a lot more choice now. And I would say most college universities do want to allow you to submit standardized testing if that testing will add value to your application. So it's, I think, a wonderful thing to be able to have that choice in being able to choose whether or not to submit your standardized testing as a credential that you want a college university to consider. Maybe a couple of other recommendations that I would have for you that Brian, that you didn't touch on that might be kind of complementary to what some of the information you shared with them. One would be with regard to recommendation letters. I would say, that is, in the absence of standardized testing, maybe an area where college universities are placing a little bit more emphasis than they did maybe 4 or 5 years ago. I know it's something that we're paying more attention to, and things like whether or not we're inviting students to join our honors program, whether or not we're considering students for really specific scholarship programs that we have. But you might find that letters of recommendation have increasing weight in the admission process by the time you're applying for college universities in your senior year. I don't really have any good advice about how to get a really strong letter of recommendation. That really isn't something that you can control. You can control who writes your letter of recommendation. You're going to have the power over selecting the 1 or 2 faculty members that you ask to write on your behalf. I would say, my best advice I could give to you is, if you really want a strong letter of recommendation, be a nice person for the next 3 or 4 years. I mean, those are the students that get the strongest letters of recommendation. If you're going to be a schmuck for the next 3 or 4 years, you're likely not going to get a really warm, loving letter of recommendation in your senior year. So if you want those strong letters of recommendation, really be a good citizen. And I don't mean a United States citizen, I mean a citizen within your community. Really be a good community member. Really get to know everyone in your school community. Get to know the people that are not necessarily, I think what sometimes students believe is that in order to get a really powerful letter of recommendation, they have to ask the faculty members or the college counselors or the principal or the headmaster that wields the most power. And the reality is, the people I find that get the strongest letter of recommendation are those students that know all of the people who don't hold a lot of power in their school communities. So those students who really know the people that pick up after them, the people that clean up after them, the people that check their IDs, the people that serve the food. Those are the folks that tend to get the strongest, warmest letters of recommendation. So if you really want a strong letter of recommendation, really just be a nice person for the next 3 or 4 years. And then, maybe a couple of other observations that don't necessarily have to do with the admission process, but with regard to finances. I don't think it's ever too early to really start thinking about the financial component of college universities. The reality is that, unless you've been hiding under a rock, you probably know that college universities in the United States particularly are expensive institutions. Even public institutions can be more expensive than what perhaps you might remember when you were applying to college universities. So I don't think it's ever too early to really think about how you're going to avoid making reckless financial decisions. And, I think sometimes students or sometimes parents start this process with telling or sharing with their students or their kids that they just need to worry about the admission process. They just need to worry about their college applications, and, they will make it happen, and they will indulge whatever college university they have been admitted to, and will find a way to make it financially happen. And sometimes that's not always the reality. And if financial aid is going to be an important part of your decision making, I would strongly encourage families become familiar with not only the FAFSA, which is a document that you've likely already been exposed to, or you likely are already aware of, the free application for federal student aid, but most private college universities in America, at least the usual suspects and the places that are really popular, also require an additional kind of common application for financial aid called the CSS Financial Aid Profile. And it's a beast. It's a really difficult online form to complete. And it's something that, if financial aid is going to be an important part of your decision making, it's something that you should start to really investigate and be exposed to. And then maybe, the last observation that I have is, I think the most successful college search process starts with the acceptance that you're going to deal with some level of rejection, and to not fear that rejection. I think if you go through this process, if you start this process imagining that everything is going to work out and you're going to go to your first choice college university and you're not going to be denied by any college university, this process can be far more anxious ridden and far more stressful than it really needs to be. But if you start in the 9th grade or 10th grade with the acceptance that this is likely going to be a component, this rejection or this denial from 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 college universities is going to be a reality that's part of this process, I don't think this process is really something to fear. And, I say that with personal experience. I'm somebody that went through the process and thought he had a first choice when he applied to college universities in his senior year, and applied early decision to a university. I applied to Syracuse University, early decision, sight unseen. I had never seen the place. I had never been to upstate New York, but I knew that Syracuse was my first choice, and I knew that I was willing to enter into a binding commitment with an institution that I had never seen before. And thankfully, Syracuse denied me flat out, even before the regular decision round, and I was denied from my first choice and was really upset about it, really distraught, but pretty quickly picked up myself off the carpet or off the floor and fell in love with another university and applied to a whole other collection of universities. I applied to BU and Northeastern and Emerson, a bunch of other different places, got in all of them, got into BU, got into Northeastern, got into Emerson, but for whatever reason, couldn't afford to, not for whatever reason, but for financial reasons, couldn't afford to go to any of those three that I just mentioned. I remember BU was probably my second choice at the time. So I ended up, as Brian mentioned, I ended up receiving my undergraduate degree from the University of New Hampshire. So I had, a little bit of heartache with regard to the admission process. I had a little bit of heartache with regard to financial decisions that needed to be made in my family. And I found myself going to the University of New Hampshire, which was maybe my third or fourth choice. And, as God is my witness, if I could scroll back to 1988, and if I could choose to go to college all over again, I could choose to go to any one of the places that I've represented before, or if I could go back to the University of New Hampshire, I'd go to the University of New Hampshire. I mean, it was 4 years of Xanadu. I mean, it was 4 years of magic. It was the best. And I hate to say that it was the best 4 years of my life, because I don't want to make it sound like my life has been kind of a downward spiral since 1992, but it was a wonderful experience, and I wouldn't change it for the world. And I think if you check in with most graduating seniors of a college university where they are departing, they'll give you kind of the same reaction that, maybe it wasn't their first choice, maybe it wasn't their second or third choice, but wherever it is they ultimately landed, kind of goes back to where Brian started. Everything's going to be okay. You're likely going to be just fine, regardless of where a college university is on your pecking order in 9th grade or 10th grade. So I would just encourage you to kind of accept a little rejection even before you start the process. And if you do that, you're largely going to be okay.
Cool.
Brian, you were an admission officer, I'm an admission officer, I can talk for another 3 hours.
That was excellent. And a lot of those themes are so important, Shawn. You're talking about Teacher X. Financial part of this, that's something that actually we're doing Teacher X with our juniors this week. We have all of our, just so you guys know, as you parents of 9th and 10th graders, as we move forward, we work with our juniors by May, first week in May. All juniors have selected 2 teachers.
Perfect.
They right for them. We have that done before the summer, and all those conversations that Shawn was mentioning, like who to ask. We are having those discussions right now with our juniors. But like you said, Shawn, we tell 9th and 10th graders, the way you treat people, the way you're willing to give a little in class, all those things go a long way to, you're going to get a supportive and good rec from anybody at SCH, but, level of enthusiasm and support, as Shawn was saying, is becoming, I think we've seen becoming more important, although it's interesting because some schools now only take 1 letter or they cap it at 2 letters. So it's interesting that schools have sort of said what they don't want is 5, they don't want more of the same. And I think that's something, sometimes we talk to students and their families like, well, what about my coach? What about my boss? What about this? And we've had to say, especially recently, it's like, look, most of these places are only taking 2.
It's really your faculty that college universities want to hear from, especially in the absence of standardized testing. I mean, your coach, your boss, your pastor, your rabbi, all of those folks can add really nice things, but it's really your faculty that are going to validate your academic record. So those are the folks that I think most college universities want to hear from.
All right, Shawn, we have our first question here, and this is, I think, a good one. All right, so given the COVID year last year for students who are now in 10th grade, do you think that admissions will give consideration to 9th grade academic performance, maybe asterisk as extenuating circumstances? Some kids were not even in the classroom, for example. Obviously, last year was sort of, schools were all over the map from hybrid back into person. I mean, I'm sure you've talked about that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I would say college universities, regardless of the selectivity, have had to kind of recalibrate their expectations as we've kind of moved through this pandemic. If you look at the kind of resume or the common application activity chart of most seniors that we're reviewing right now, I mean, we've largely concluded the admission process, but throughout the year, as we've really reviewed kind of the extracurricular accomplishments of most graduating seniors this year, they don't look like they did 5 years ago because students didn't have the same extracurricular opportunities as students did 5 years ago. So I would say, generally speaking, college universities are recalibrating their expectations based on world events. But that is something that you need to realize. This was a world event. So COVID-19 was kind of the great equalizer. It's not as if COVID-19 only hit the city of Philadelphia and your grades may have been impacted. This was something that really impacted students around the world. And in some areas of the world, even more harshly than we were impacted here in Greater Philadelphia. So yes, I would say college universities are recalibrating their expectations, both academically and extracurricularly, but also within the kind of global context of what everyone experienced. And I don't know if this will still be in place by the time you're applying for admission 3 to 4 years from now. But right now, for, I believe it was last year's class and this year's class, there was a section in the common application where students could devote some real estate to kind of any extenuating circumstances with regard to the pandemic, so that you weren't obligated to kind of like write your essay about COVID-19. Like no college admission officer wanted to read an essay about COVID. So if you had kind of any extenuating circumstances or anything that you wanted the admission office to know, to explain anything, you could use that real estate. I just don't know if that's going to be there 3 to 4 years from now.
All right, we have a question here that certainly, Shawn, I'd love your thoughts, and Polly, if you want to chime in, because you've had a recent son go through. What's your opinion on gap years?
Paul, you had a son that just went through a gap year? Daughter?
Yeah, I had a son. He's now a junior in college, but he took a gap year after he graduated from high school, and it was the best thing he could have done. He was not a terribly motivated high school student, and I think taking a year and doing real life. He lived in Philadelphia. He worked for City Year, so he was in a school in Kensington for the year as a teacher's aide, and I think that that experience was really shaping and started him off in college with a sense of purpose and seriousness that he would not have had otherwise.
I mean, I think we'd probably all agree college is wasted on the young. Like we all start college way too early. You can't appreciate it as much as you could if you were just a little bit older. So I don't know of anybody that doesn't celebrate and love the idea of students taking gap years. But to me, a gap year is you still apply for the college universities that are of interest to you while you're in school, and then you request the gap year after you're offered admission. Sometimes I think students confuse gap year with, well, I'm going to apply to Harvard this year, and if it doesn't work out, I'm going to take a gap year. I'm going to apply to Harvard all over again next year, and I'm going to be a more competitive candidate. And to me, that's not really the purpose of a gap year. But yeah, I would say most college universities love to have students that are just a little bit more mature and a little bit more purposeful.
So again, if you guys want to type in questions, Shawn, while there may be some more questions coming, could you maybe give your thoughts? I mentioned about athletics, and I mean, you guys are a Division I school and you have a pretty wide range of sports. I mean, when do you think, is there an end to this kind of, the portal madness may never end, but just the NCAA backlog of what are you seeing at Temple? Like, what are your coaches telling you? I mean, what are your thoughts we have a lot of student athletes, parents of student athletes in the audience, and
I don't know what to predict there. I mean, I just, especially with the transfer portal and that kind of new dynamic to intercollegiate athletics. And I do think, and you mentioned this in your remarks, this isn't just a Division I thing. This is a Division II and a Division III thing, especially if you're talking about NESCAC schools and you're talking about the University Athletic Association. I came to Temple from NYU, and that collection of universities is a super aggressive athletic conference, even though it's a Division III conference. I'm not even sure what to predict there. I'm not sure.
What else? Other questions you guys have? There's
one thing that you did mention that I hope everybody heard, that the sweeping majority of American college universities admit the majority of their applicants. I think there's a ton, and because this is the time of year where this happens, there's a ton of media attention on this very small collection of college universities that have super low admit rates and had kind of this explosion in their applicant pools this year. But, the reality is the sweeping majority of college universities are still admitting the sweeping majority of students who are applying. So, if you're fixated on MIT, Purdue's still admitting the majority of students that are applying for admission. If you're fixated on the University of Michigan, the University of Wisconsin, and Indiana are still admitting the sweeping majority of students who are applying. So for every college university that has a super low admit rate, I can almost find you a carbon copy of that institution or something that really looks and feels like it that has a much, much higher admit rate.
All right, we got some. So this is, do colleges take into consideration if a student is a graduate from a college prep school versus a non-college prep school, public, Catholic? I mean,
Well, I mean, to a degree, sure. Yeah. I mean, I would say, like I mentioned, that when I was at Columbia, I was the person for reviewing, or at least doing the first read of all the students who had applied from the greater Philadelphia area. And it was my responsibility to educate. I mean, at the time, the two schools were two separate schools, and it was really my responsibility to explain and share with the rest of the admissions committee what Springside was like, what Chestnut Hill Academy was like, what Central was like, what Girls High was like, and really illuminate maybe different characteristics about the school profile that I felt like the admissions committee needed to be aware of. So in certain cases, maybe we might be more forgiving for a couple of C's on a transcript, where we might not be forgiving for a couple of C's on a transcript for a student coming from a different school. So yeah, I would say that context is something that, especially at the highly selective level, I mean, if you're looking at any of the Ivies, if you're looking at really any of the kind of places that you're probably all obsessed by, you can probably safely assume that there is at least one person in the admissions office that really takes great care to educate everybody else on the admissions committee about the different nuance that you need to be associated, that you need to be aware of in evaluating candidates. I mean, I always joke with, it's not really a joke, but I think people think it's entertaining that, like, when I was the dean of admissions at NYU, like, that was like a big job. But really, another big job that I had in that admissions office was I was the first reader of all the students who applied to NYU from Iran, Iraq, Israel, Yemen, Syria, Alabama, and Mississippi. So if you applied from that part of the world, I was your guy. I was the guy who had to explain what was the difference between, Jackson Prep and Jackson Academy, two high schools in Jackson, Mississippi. I needed to really be able to distinguish between the two and educate everybody else on the admissions committee what that transcript looked like, why a student might be really competitive, even in the absence of AP courses or IB courses. Maybe that school didn't offer an IB program or an AP program. So I would say, generally speaking, you should probably safely assume that that context is going to be taken into consideration.
few more popped in here. So a couple of questions about testing. One says, should my daughter even take the SAT or ACT? I mean, we're going to want to encourage all of our students to take it at least once. Most kids are probably going to still take it twice, even with test optional, just because.
Why not?
Again, why? Yeah, exactly. Why not? So that's probably an easier answer. Doesn't matter if you take the SAT or ACT. Do some students take both? Both are given, and Shawn, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but both tests are given the same credit. Our philosophy is not to take both, just to do it. But sometimes students have a bad experience. Maybe they take the SAT twice and they're just like, I need a school where I feel like I need a score for some reason. I'm going to do the ACT, but some students do take both. My guess is in our community, it might be 25% or 30% of our kids take both. But yeah, so I just wanted to answer those quickly. I mean, again, I don't know if you have any thoughts on SAT or ACT.
20 to 30% take both?
Well, maybe, I don't know. Do you guys think that's about, I mean, I think it's 15%.
That's depressing.
Maybe 15%.
Lower?
But see what some test prep people want. There's certain, I will just say, there are definitely some people out there who push to take both. It's not our request, so that's probably why. All right, so here we have a question.
I don't know of any college university in the entire United States that has a preference for one or the other.
Yeah, that's the most important thing. So this is a parent. We have an academically strong generalist on our hands, interested in everything from science to theater, and no specific focus for schools or what she wants to do. Is that seen as a disadvantage in selective college admissions?
I mean, I think that's the beauty of the American system of higher education. I mean, I would say if we're in the United Kingdom, you're kind of screwed. But in the United States, that's really what we do best. I mean, we welcome students that don't have a defined academic path. And most college universities are in love with students that aren't 100% committed or 110% committed to a specific academic discipline and are open to the different possibilities that they might explore in a particular college university. I would say, though, that there is a difference between a student who is undecided and uninterested. I mean, there are some students who just don't have any interest in academic things, and that's pretty easy to spot in an application for admission. But to me, that's very different than the student who is a generalist or has an interest in multiple academic areas. So I don't think it's a disadvantage. The only way, or the only possibility where I could see it could be a disadvantage, or maybe you need to really consult with your college counselor about your choices, is that, and you have likely, many of you have likely already discovered this, but at a lot of major American research universities, we're divided into different schools and colleges. So you do need to be careful. Like, let's say you're choosing to apply to NYU or BU or Temple. You know, we're major research universities that are really these kind of kingdoms of individual schools and colleges. And if you are truly undecided, you do need to choose wisely about which of those schools and colleges is going to be the most welcoming for that particular student. And sometimes students don't choose wisely and find themselves that lack of demonstrated interest in a specific academic area doesn't kind of position them favorably within the context of that university.
And that's definitely a really important conversation we have with our sort of juniors now leading into the summer. You know, applying to the school within a school is just how you applied. You know, that little drop down that you pick, the schools may not even tell you, but we know certain classes you don't have, certain classes you do have. It really can matter for those kind of cool schools within a school, and that's something we see. It's becoming even more tight with you know, business, engineering, some of the small STEM majors, those kinds of things. So it looks like you guys are questioned out, and yeah, I think it's 7:50, so it's probably a good time to go. Oh, somebody beat us. Somebody raised their hand. One last one here. Well, I don't know if the raised hand feature is going to. Oh, there we go. Oh, just saying this was great. All right, I'll take that as a good ending. Okay. Thank you for that. And Shawn, that was awesome. Really appreciate you being here from down the road. And yeah, I thank you all for coming out tonight. Again, it's a beautiful night out, and you shared 50 minutes of your time with us. And any last words? Are you good?
We're good.
Right. Thank you, Shawn, again.
All right.
Thanks everybody
Have
for
a good
coming
night.
out.
Bye.
Take care, everybody.